Thank you for joining us and welcome to Haymarket Books presentation of The Narcissist. This is the launch party virtually taking place for his brilliant new book, which I hope you will all pick up. Text messages or how I found myself time traveling. You see it there. How you doing, Narcy?
I'm good, Habib. Good to see you, man.
It's good to see you too. We now are at a period of time that is truly, truly exceptional. We have seen the biggest public health failing in certainly US history, possibly British history. I'm not sure about the situation in Canada, but we are definitely coming to you from two collapsed economies. We saw an opening of what they call the Overton window, whereby the possibility of different political futures presented themselves. We saw universal basic income spoken about. We saw ideas which only a few months before it had been seen as politically impossible. However, when there was a good direction out of the crisis, there was also a bad direction out of the crisis. One good direction would have been the nationalizing of industries, decarbonizing our economies, a recognition of who it is that makes up the lungs, heart, and spine of society. And in consideration that countries like Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, and of course China had handled the COVID crisis better than the United States, countries which had all been on the receiving end of US imperialism within the last 50 to 60 years. There was also a bad direction out of the crisis. That bad direction was the bailing out of those companies rather than the nationalizing of them. It was the blaming of the external other in a way that could morph into war propaganda. It was increased surveillance, and it was the deepening of the very logics that have made coping with this crisis so much harder. We know that after the Black Death of the 1300s, which is estimated by some to have killed half of Europe's population, you saw a massive increase in anti-Semitism and the scapegoating of people and even targeting of them as witches. You saw a lot of the methods that were used to interrogate people suspected of being witches being used upon quote unquote plague spreaders. Now, in this situation where it is projected that half of the world's workforce, that is 1.7 billion people, are projected by some to lose their jobs, where 65 million people across the United States in the months that have passed have been told you are fired, and only 25 million of those people are still now left without jobs. The rest of them, it seems, have found other employment. We've also seen money that is sent home from these metropoles, what they call remittances, have decreased by 28%, meaning that economies like Nepal or Tajikistan, 30% of their GDP is based on money that is sent home from others. Places like Nigeria, where something like $24 billion is sent home yearly, or Egypt, where $27 billion is sent home yearly. We've seen that decrease by 28%. So while the burden is distributed unevenly on a domestic level, here in Britain, you are, of course, 4.2 times more likely to die from COVID if you are a black man. You are 1.8 times more likely to die from it if you are Pakistani or Bengali man. A lot of that has been linked to overcrowding in housing, with the English Housing Survey finding that only 2% of white British households are overcrowded, whereas 30% of Bengali households and 16% of Pakistani households and 12% of black households experience overcrowding. We have seen the restructuring of society in a major way. And we have also seen, and this leads me on to my first question for you, Narcy, the reconfiguring of the relationship between people and work in a major way. And one of the things that Yuval Noah Harari said, the writer of Sapiens, two of the most important skills that our children should learn growing up now will be, number one, emotional intelligence, but secondly, mental stability. And the reason for stability is that they will have to adapt and change their method of work every few years. When we think about automation, when we think about this process in which people are unable to physically stand near each other, how are you thinking about the future of work for yourself?
Well, first and foremost, I think my thinking at this time was about taking this time to reanalyze what I do and what the people around me, both from a standpoint of how we treat the planet in our work, from the way we produce things to the way we consume things. And then secondly, I think the thing I've been thinking about the most is how do I create a safety net for my children and a literacy of media at their age, them being, not both under 10. But I think those are where I've been focusing most of my attention, both in my music, in my teaching profession, in all the fields that I'm in. So I want to acknowledge that I feel like we're in a not only a political, I hate the word quagmire, but in a political crisis, we are very much in a spiritual crisis as well. As a world, I think we're rethinking our relationship to each other. By distancing each other, we're starting to think about the worth of our relationships and how important they are actually in the continuation of life, right? And you and I both know our work is so reliant on what it makes people feel, outside of the physical products of CDs or shows or T-shirts or whatever, or videos that people watch of ours. It's all about the feeling that we're leaving with people and that's what they're connecting to. That's what we connected to through hip hop music. So I'm starting to think about my work and the impact of it and the legacy of the work of myself and the community that I'm in, and having these conversations internally about how to move forward. I'm not really worried about not doing shows. I love doing shows and performing, but it's really not that important right now. I find like artists that are forcing public performances and putting their audiences in plastic bubbles in order to be around each other is kind of selfish. It's like, why are you marketing your music publicly when it's dangerous for people? Let people experience it at home. There's different ways of working that, right? So just thinking about like online presence and not being too immersed in the digital part of it, but definitely leaning towards making it both educational and entertainment at the same time somehow, And shifting my focus to behind the camera as opposed to time,
Yeah, because you are not only a writer, an artist, you are also an educator, and that has also had to radically change, whereby the classes have had to go online. Here in this country, we have seen the government make quite clear that they view support for the arts as less of a priority than support for other sectors. And even when they are giving some support to the arts, some subsidy to the arts, they're very particular about where that is going. Now, I'm interested, this will no doubt lead to an exodus of people from the arts industry to other places. And they literally have launched a campaign that is encouraging people to retrain and get into other places. So is there anything in Canada that exists to support independent artists such as yourself?
Yeah, I mean, Montreal specifically is a very artistic city, a very multimedia city. We have great artists and actors and musicians that come out of the city, and uh, the city is a bit of a crutch to that, right? Like I've had to leave Montreal in order to continue my career because the ceiling is very low, but it's inspired all my work. So when this happened, there was a great worry in Canada about the effect it's going to have on these industries specifically. I don't think they were thinking about the artists more than they were thinking about because it's a big part of the Canadian economy. So yeah, there were grants that were released specifically in Quebec for artists, for visual artists, for filmmakers, for people to create digital dissemination of works, public displays. We're also coming in on a cold winter, so they've got to create something to get the people engaged with outdoors as opposed to indoor spaces, so there are grants, but I don't know if that's going to save. There are many venues being shut down, there are many places that are slowly, and we're not going to feel the effects of what's happening today till 6 months, 7 months from now. So I'm sure things are going to change. I just wonder what's going to happen to festival funding and performances for artists that were crucial for the survival of the artists here in Montreal. But Canada definitely put a priority on the arts because it's a big part of their culture economy.
Right. As a generation of Iraqis that grew up outside, we were not present in the country at the time of the sanctions. We were not present in the country at the time of the Gulf War. In fact, both of us were in countries whose armies were mobilized during the Gulf War against the country that we had roots in. And then in 2003, we also were here. Now, throughout that period, for people like us, not only do we both live in countries that are part of the US government's Five Eyes network. So that is essentially governments that facilitate the US spying on their own citizens, which is different. In other places, they have to make more effort to get access to our information. But a lot of work by Glenn Greenwald, Edward Snowden, brilliant book, Permanent Record, it lays out the way the NSA functions through the Five Eyes network. The way imperialism functions is it creates industries within the metropole, especially for people like us who are of the target of that imperial power. So we would have seen people in our generations throughout the sanctions. There would be a few jobs available as people to kind of justify the sanctions. But particularly in 2003 is when it ramped up, where people who may have been generations above us, but they were in positions where they could have some form of work justifying US invasion. In the Daesh period, that, of course, brought in, I would say, more people from generations below us who were then able to, as to some extent is, well, not to some extent, is understandable, attest to the horrific crimes of this small, irregular organization in Daesh. Now, we also have those that can come forward, and mainly it's work in think tanks. So they are expressions of US power and a sort of what they call astroturfing, whereby you are able to depict something as grassroots when in fact it has arms in the US government. And there's so many of these think tanks. They provide the kind of ideological groundwork for US foreign policy. And a lot of people like us went into such organizations. What do you think is the best way for people like us to work with and communicate with people that are still fleeing the literally hundreds and thousands of bombs that have been dropped on Iraq by the United States? And Britain has obviously been a junior partner in that process. I'll put that to you first.
Yeah, I think like it's very difficult because in those situations, people rarely have ability to communicate with family, let alone people they don't know, right? So I think you and I have placed an intention in our work to always share these stories, number one, through our music, and being able to turn it into a for lack of better words, like a digestible piece of content for people that wouldn't want to listen in the first place. So that's the first line of duty for us as artists. I've never, ever taken my platform for granted in that sense, because every other day you hear of a story that's completely crushing to your humanity and your faith in it, right? And these stories continue. You know, the other day was the 20th anniversary of Mohammed al-Durra's execution in Palestine, and to see that photo again, you remember, like, I was working back then on the same things I'm working on now, but it's still as devastating to think back to an individual story. So that's one. And then what I've been doing is really monitoring what is trending on social media and utilizing my platform to raise funds that go directly to children, whether it's to build wells for them or to children in need of dire surgery to survive in our country. Those have been like direct actions that I do. And then to just like educate myself and read and connect with people and find out stories from them and share on whatever platforms I have. That's really all we can do. You know, the idea of thoughts and prayers to me is very self-satisfying. You know, I'm going to go pray for you and then khalas, I've dealt with what I've dealt with. So I've always felt like we need to do direct action, but sometimes it's so overwhelming, I don't really know what to do. And I'm sure you've been in that position, because you have stories that are in your neighborhood, that are in your city in London, and then stories that you hear of people in Iraq or in Jordan or in Syria or in Yemen or in Palestine, and it's just endless. So I ask myself this every day, like, what are we doing? Who are we representing? Why are we doing? And how can we do better? You know?
I think I completely agree with the point that you made about focusing on the material relationship and that practice of directing people towards donating to good organizations in Iraq. Another thing that I think was useful for some from our generation was serving as translators rather than, say, translators for the US military, as was a job ready and waiting for many Iraqis within the metropoles, as translators for people on migration cases, people that were trying to reach places that had been built up by this process, like Britain, like the United States, like Canada. Also building legal cases, whether it was small individual claims for reparations, for compensation from families that had died because of the British military in Basra, for example. You had a lot of cases in Britain with the MOD paying out over 20 million pounds. Now, of course, the British government has put in legislation to really block those attempts to really get justice for people that had lost family members. But I think as a diasporic community, it's important that we are able to develop a sort of integrity with the way that we are communicating with the place that we're from, because so often you see people fall into that situation of working for those structures. And I think that it's fantastic. Like you said, the important thing is the material side of it, but then also the role we can sort of play as a bridge.
And I think a very important thing is, and this is in no way comparable, but experiencing our parents' generations shift to North America, not for the same reasons, but watching what they went through in a easier transition, I would say, but it was still difficult on them. Watching whether it be the language barriers or the struggle that they face with work and, you know, coming here and having to start over with children. These are extreme forms of trauma for the families that are now shifting to the West from our countries. So to build a sense of community and it helps a lot, you know, I think. Yeah. And that individual, each one, reach one mentality, it eventually builds a web. So I think that's also extremely important, is find out what's happening in your city. You know, if they need clothes, they need guidance, they need whatever they need, you know, just try to be there for people on an individual level. community is king, you know, or queen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, to the book. Now, I've enjoyed reading this. It's not your first book. You released Diatribes of a Dying Tribe quite a few years ago. And was that self-published?
Yeah, that was my master's thesis that I had written for Concordia, and I turned it into a self-published book. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I suggest to people that are picking up text messages to also look for Diatribe of a Dying Tribe. Now, from text messages, it reminded me of Einstein's, a great quote from Einstein, when he said, "It's obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." Now, while that rings true reading your book, I didn't get the feel that your book is a sort of Luddite piece. You are not saying that there is an inherent irredeemability in the mobile phone or in this kind of technology that increased, that, as you know, you make the point, has developed hand in glove with the war on terror, has increased surveillance, has increased this almost vicarious looking at another's pain, living vicariously through this instrument, but also this spectatorship of other people's suffering that can be quite damaging. But you're not quite arguing that in and of itself, the phone is inherently or represents an inherent evil. If anything, you're kind of referencing the way in which it's utilized by humans. Is that right?
Yeah, I think because I wrote a lot of this on my phone and knowing the reliance I have on the technology for both my career and my personal connection to my family, I remember Marshall McLuhan a lot when putting this book together because of his saying of the clothes being the extension of the skin, you know, and the phone is really the extension of your hand. And the internet is an extension of your brain. So it's like a external consciousness that we exist in and that we all share, which is extremely unhealthy if you think about it. It has its gifts and but it also has its curses. At the end of the day, I think we develop a form of a reliance that is extremely unhealthy to these things, right? It's these daily traumas that we experience together digitally, these videos that we watch of people being murdered and slammed on the floor or killed by a police officer or blown up into pieces. These are things that I don't think are supposed to be experienced on an individualized mass, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not sitting in a room watching it on a cinema screen. We're all individually experiencing it, so which is different. So yeah, I do think it's the way that tech companies are using these phones and tracking our behavior in order to create an economic system around our spiritual and personal needs. That is the toxic part of the phone. But the connectivity that we've developed is incredible. And I think, you know, from here on out, every form of technology and every growth from the phone onwards is going to have that. And we're going to have to decide, is it worth it? Is it worth having a robot in my house that's going to learn my algorithm of how I live my day and prepare my coffee for me in the morning? Or am I going to take the time to prepare the coffee myself? You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think we're at a precipice, just like everything else. You know, the timing of the universe is not, it's not haphazard. Everything is kind of in question right now. And our phones and technologies, we're at a breaking point. Like, if we go any further from here, we have to have a responsibility and an intention with our work beyond business. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I mean, these things that we carry about with us are primarily instruments of surveillance-based advertising. Yeah. But, you know, Lizzie O'Neill has this great book, Lizzie O'Shea, has this great book, Future Histories, in which she tries to pave a way using historical precedents that we can find a form of digital self-determination that we don't currently have with the way that things are set up. Now, what you said actually leads me on to one question about something that you say in the book. So you have these really great you kind of intersplice it with bits of graphic, and with so the big homie said, "I don't want to make history. It repeats itself." But there's one of these quotes that I thought was quite interesting, and the quote was, "Your child, or was it your child's child?
Child, yeah,
will probably love a robot." But what's quite interesting about that is when we think about the extent to which AI is operating probably hundreds of experiments on us daily through our mobile phones, and the physical proximity with which we keep our mobile phones, and the extent to which we look at it probably more than any other human being in the world, it's almost as if we already do love robots.
Yeah, I mean, we do.
You know, we can.
We do.
Which is pretty amazing.
Robots are designed to love you in a way. It gives you what you want. You know, tools of propaganda are not teaching you anything new. They're repeating to you the same things that you already believe and strengthening them in your mind. It's a muscle. So at the end of the day, these phones are just serving as agendas to yourself. You are your own. Jeremy Scahill said this to me. I interviewed him recently, and he said, you know, for the longest time, people used to point and say, they're the problem. They are doing this to us. But really, we have become the they. We kind of have become our own propagandists, our own dictators, our own control mechanisms and systems. And these phones are just facilitating it for us. So,
yeah. I mean, I agree, but also I would think that our agency is slightly dulled when it comes to the mobile phone, in that as power has always done, is it designs technologies that can bind people into social arrangements that they may not A, completely understand, or B, even agree with, especially if they did understand. And I think the phone, in the way it uses our information and the way it deduces information about us from us, is, you know, at no point, if I was to ask you, Narcy, write 5,000 sentences that begin with the word I am, I don't think you could. But your phone's function is creating those 5,000 character points about who you are. So we're actually at a stage now where that information is available to the highest bidder, and it knows us better than we know ourselves. Now that is a pretty scary kind of situation for us to be in. But just to ask you to deliver one of the poems in the book. Now, the book has a beautiful cartoon in the middle of it, apocalyptic cartoon, I would say, which perfectly captures your rippling biceps.
Listen, I was only inspired by you. I used you as the
So and it has poems throughout, and we also get to a beautiful short story at the end, a beautiful but tragic short story at the end. But if you were able to read to us now this poem, The Heist That Is.
Sure. The Heist That Is. It's back to bombs over Baghdad. No outcasts here. All are welcome. Doors open and closed policy. Politics as usual. No Jay-Z either. Ether me, ya Nas. Drone, sweet drone, walk me home. No war except class. No class when there is war. Students see the teacher die and become it. A scene to digest, heart to stomach. Tired of humanity. We have done this dance before. My feet tired, B. Fire the man who hired thee. Son of a bitch leaders, your mothers would be ashamed of you. Remember, she is buried in the earth you drop bombs on, so that's bombs on your moms. Martin Scorsese couldn't imagine, couldn't fill enough bodies into this chasm. Phantasm, the beast feeding in action. Thug life never pays off. You're nobody till somebody kills you. Kill somebody till you're nobody. Then somebody kills you. This is just gangster shit. Numb to the watch, but some bodies kill you. You see numbers, I see children. You see rubble where I saw buildings. The murderers murder each other. Makes you unsee the violence they uncover. History only repeats itself, then deletes itself.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, it reminded me in the bit where you are saying you see rubble where I see buildings. It reminded me of a beautiful poem by Mahmoud Darwish called The House as a Casualty. And I suggest people check that out in his book, River Died of Thirst. But there was also a phrase here that I was really interested in. History only repeats itself, then deletes itself. What did you mean by that?
I wrote this piece. This was one of the last pieces that I added to the book. We were actually already edited and gone through, but then the revolution about a year ago in Iraq started. And I was watching live footage on, I think it was Amir Hazm's IG feed, and watching what the people were going through, and then watching the news and seeing how it was presented in Canada, in the UK, and then in the Arab world. And what we have experienced in 20 years of our careers, we've witnessed multiple deletions of history, in the sense that people like Saddam were taken, which was a great step forward for Iraq, but they were also deleted. You know, Osama was taken and deleted. There's reasoning for these, people that they prop up as villains who are actually allies at one point to be deleted because they probably know a history that they don't want us to really retain or remember, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think a lot of it has to do with this thought that I've been having that that keeps coming back to me, and I've said this somewhere before, I don't remember where, but that we're at a point in history, in my opinion, where we're seeing the decline of humanity because of technology. The reliance is being laid more upon technology than on humanity. So I feel like maybe the Sumerians, who were also, murderous, or the Egyptians, who were also, I'm sure, not great rulers, or whatever empire there was before, they may have been more advanced than us because they were more connected to their physical being and presence on the planet. So I think that's a big part of it too, is like this news cycle that removes what happened 5 minutes ago to replace it with something else. But also that when it comes down to my children being 30, or that generation being in their 30s, what are they going to remember of our time? I've had students at university at the age of 18 who don't know what Guantanamo is when I show them the picture. And that's crazy to me, right? Because that's such a defining moment in my life. They'll remember that Tupac died, even though he died way before they were even alive, but they won't remember injustices as great as Guantanamo, right? Were done in our name, who we are responsible for to a certain degree. So that's what I meant by that line, is that history repeats itself. It does the same shit to people, and then it deletes itself. So you don't remember, and they do it to you all over again,
I think also what you're speaking to really then in that line is the way in which the algorithm is not formed in an organic process. So you have companies like Google, who it's been revealed recently, favor in search results companies that they themselves are invested in. You also saw YouTube say that a lot of it was off the back of the 2016 election. They came out and said, in a bid to battle fake news and disinformation, they would prioritize in search results trusted and reliable sources. Now, who were those trusted and reliable sources? They were Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, The Sun, Rupert Murdoch. They were some generally right-wing outlets that would be part of that kind of invisibilizing of something like Guantanamo Bay. So really, in that sense, do you see the function of your art as almost a revenge of history then?
Yeah, I think the way I view it is, when we started, there was no template for us to follow besides what the African American community did through hip hop. That was like the Afro-Caribbean community in the UK as well, obviously, and all the communities that grew out of this culture of hip hop and dance hall that were documenting not only the injustices that they were experiencing, but the good times that they were having. So it was a documentation outside of the circle of the system's documentation of history. And as much as hip hop was co-opted by business, it always circles back to telling you the truth, because artists speak power and are so immediate in their conversation. So when we started, we looked into our community, and we had Mahmoud Darwish, and we had, Muzaffar and Nawab, and poets that were not from the diaspora, but from back home, that were speaking on their political realities at the time. But we had nobody besides Edward Said really guiding us as MCs or vocalists or documentarians or writers that allowed us to feel like we had a space to exist. And that was something I thought of very early in my career, that I want to leave work for the next MC or the next writer or the next poet from our community to look back and read all of our work. That's why I did Diatribes, was to look back at these points in history and feel like, okay, chapter 1 was written, I'm going to write chapter 2,
That's really interesting, because when talking about the kind of public sphere as a contested space, and then the establishing of precedents and allowing people to come after it. For instance, your video Fatwa, I don't think I've ever told you this, but it allowed me to speak musically about something that on one hand is quite a troubling process that millions and millions of people have gone throughout the world. But it allowed me to address it through music, to feel comfortable to address it through, for instance, your track, or Min al-Irhabi by Dam. These kind of songs helped me formulate a kind of lexicon with which to battle some of these well-funded mythologies about who we were, So it's really interesting that you say that.
We all reverberate into each other's lives. I think I learned this from MCs that I, like Nas or Mos or Lauren, or the people that were the most vulnerable in their music were the people that made me feel safe to say whatever I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And I would be doing a great disservice to the microphone that's in front of me if I don't use it that way, And you have also directly inspired me to keep going. And I have a tug of war between the world and its ills. So like for me, I always looked at all of our peers as pushing each other in this race that we're all running through.
For sure, man. And another poem that I would love you to deliver for us is "This Ain't a Movie, Dog."
I think that's, there it is. I just opened it on that page.
Wow.
So, generation fed on overkill. The wonder kids who appreciate but underlive. You know the drill. Streets paved with the oil spills. Fire blaze on the soil. Shot gray spots sprayed by our mortal ills. Ew. Moral filling in your morning cereal. You'd rather scream, but there's nobody hearing you. This is life as a music video. Except the camera is your brain and the actor is your pain. You hear laughter when it rains, it pours. Love and fear, my brother, are very dear and live near each other. What's a gun but insecurity and impurity, revering each other, and a tear when we meet each other. Same movie, dog.
So if you want to see that, you want to read that, you want to enjoy that brilliant work from Narcy, you want to get that book right now. So there's a line in that I want to ask you about. When you say, love and fear, my brother, are very dear and live near each other. What's a gun but insecurity and impurity, revering each other? What do you mean by that?
The line about love and fear, I mean, at a young age, we're taught to love and fear our parents. And then you're taught to love and fear God, right? And there's this attachment between this positive feeling and this negative feeling, which I think the outcome of that, or the child of that, is guilt, right? Which is a big part of being where we're from. There's a sense of guilt that our parents carried, that we inherited, and I think that came from their parents, and I'm sure you feel this as well. whether it be like survivor's guilt or any form of guilt, family guilt. So that's what I really meant by that line. Instead of saying we are all guilty of these sins that exist on earth, I just wanted to say it in that way, that I know in between these two feelings, I feel guilty about both in a way,
Wow.
And then what is a gun but a way of projecting a power that you don't have or that you want to exercise on another person by murdering them or executing them or hurting them without your own physical means. It's something that is external to you, that is that extrapolates power of 100 men or 100 human beings into one bullet. So that's really what it is. And this poem was written a long time ago. Actually, it's on a song that I did with a rapper from the city called Lopeshi, and somebody else was on it. It's a K-Tronada produced song that we put out. And I had written it, generation fed on overkill. It was, again, about watching all this death on the internet. And we're wonder kids who appreciate, but we underlive. Like, we appreciate and grateful for what we have, but at the end of the day, we're dulled by all the shit that's around us. So it's about that dichotomy that's constantly pulling us,
I mean, this love and fear and the child of it being, and this then linking of that to this projection of violence made me think of a couple of things, like Alfred Nobel, for example, who's credited with inventing dynamite. Part of the reason that towards the end of his life he came up with the idea of the Nobel Prize was because of the guilt that he felt about what dynamite was going to do to other people.
What it did. Yeah.
and the idea behind it being somebody that is in fear creating this kind of stuff that would then be used to harm other people, then creating guilt. And then it was the same with Oppenheimer, with the Manhattan Project, for the building of the nuclear bomb for the United States. He was another person, who said, death has become me. He felt deeply and intensely guilty about...
I always wonder with characters of this like, or presidents or leaders of countries that in their power reign make decisions that as a human being, are inherently wrong, and they make it for the perpetuation of whatever strength that country has, the love and fear that people have for your country, or the love and fear of losing power, and then later apologizing for it. It doesn't, like, we're at a point in history now where you can't undo these injustices that happen to the Native American community of this continent, or the indigenous communities of Palestine or of Iraq or wherever you might think of. These injustices can't be made up. You can't, taking a man to court will not bring back the people that were killed. So I always wonder, like, you're going to create a prize for peace out of your negative creation to humanity. It's not going to make things any better, Sorry, go ahead, bro.
That's it.
That was it.
You sure?
Yeah, I can go on for ages.
Go ahead.
No, I find it very, like, now watching Donald Trump be such a horrible leader for the United States, and then Bush's people being like, oh shit, this is the good window to do PR around your painting and like reset your legacy before you die, so that when you die, this becomes the latest story that we share, not your mishappenings with Cheney and Rumsfeld, right? So it's like, it blows my mind that people get away with the shit that they get away with,
Well, I mean, also it's about thinking of, in World War I, a study that they did found that when soldiers were confronted with other people to shoot at, naturally they would try and shoot above them. So the majority of soldiers would try actually not to kill people. And so since then, the development of technology has been focusing on distancing people from the direct ramifications of what it is that they do. So absolutely. From that, you developed air bombing, you developed poisonous gas in World War I, the tanks to deal with the barbed wire, and of course, long after that, we had drones. And
now we have dogs and robots. Companies like Boston Dynamics are creating these dogs like Spot that are supposed to be helper dogs. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I've already seen videos on YouTube of drones and these dogs ramming in with huge machine guns on their back. What does that do to the next generation of war? You know, it's mind-blowing.
There's so much about our status quo and our economy which is based on the dulling of empathy, and the mechanisms and the institutions that function to dull that empathy. Because even within the supply chain, you know, the US military bases that exist in the world, yes, exist as projections of US foreign policy to threaten other countries, like the 400 military bases around China, US military bases. They mainly function, though, as providers and guarantors of the passage of goods. Because if you are trying to move your hardware around the world, you want the protection of a US naval base or a US military base near to make sure that people can't take that stuff. And so our supply chain has all types of things within it that we probably wouldn't agree with, whether it's labor relations or whether it's arrangements with US security and stuff like that. And so there has to be an extent to which you can dull people's empathy in order for that status quo to perpetuate itself. Now, I don't want to take up too much. We could talk all day about stuff like that. But the question I have
a question to pose to that, though, before you go to your next question. Sorry.
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Do you think that it is a dulling of empathy, or is it a you know, like they say, what a tangled web we weave, that we've reached a point in history where it's almost impossible for you as a citizen of a country in the quote unquote free world to separate yourself from any form of exploitation? Like, there is no way of living exploitation free in the metropoles that we live in, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to add on to that, you know, the global annual subsidies to fossil fuel companies are $5 trillion per year. Now, that's all the governments in the world combined. And the US government subsidized the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $750 billion per year. Mm. Most of the banks are invested in fossil fuel companies also. Now, it is that very addiction to these dirty fuels that is driving us to the point of climate breakdown. We're seeing huge amount of species going extinct every single day, and we're reaching a point really of no return. So yes, it's that addiction to an unethical way of arranging things and consuming, but that addiction is also fueling a point where organized human life as we know it will not be possible in the same way at all, and huge amounts of people will die, undoubtedly. So from that nihilistic vision of the future to a story which, you know, and it will lead me on to a question about nihilism or nihilism, depending on how you pronounce the word. But what is this story, Hashim, An Unfinished Life, about? It's the short story at the end of the book. What's that story about?
Well, I started writing a book about a young boy who's a fictional character that is born into a country, being Iraq, that is already stricken with war, and that he falls victim to the unjust treatment of people during an occupation. He becomes imprisoned, and emboldened by his imprisonment. I left out some chapters of the story in the book. I didn't want to finish it. I wanted to end it in his childhood. But he witnesses some very, very traumatic and tragic moments in his life that shape him to believe that he is almost godlike. In his pain, he develops a narcissism and a thirst for power that is unparalleled in the people around him. So he goes from being an innocent, it's about innocence lost, right? He goes from being an innocent child to a product of violence. I I wrote the story and I wrote it in such an extreme sense and a poetic way to allude to many prophecies that are foretold in monotheistic religions through their books, through the Quran, through the Bible, through the Torah, about an antichrist character, or like what would be instances in the world that would create a person like this, who might destroy the world in their positioning. And this is one minute example of what could create a person so dramatically driven to destroy the world around them, right? Mm. And obviously, there's no spiritual context in the. He's not a religious figure in the book, but it's just an example of, a lot of the times when we were presented stories of people from the brown community, and not just Muslims, but people from the brown community committing acts of violence, their story begins at the act of violence. There's never, and we started realizing this in our 20s when we watched Israel and Palestine specifically Palestinians being vilified when acts of violence were committed by them, but Israeli soldiers were never vilified, right? So at that young age, I started realizing how the presentation of the villain is constructed, and how there's always a backstory to it. And that doesn't justify the act, but there's always a story that needs to be told to contextualize where that comes from. And this was an example of a fictitious story of a young man who went through extremes in his life that make him want to disown everything in humanity as one,
Was he a metaphor for anything or anyone? Is he representative of something else?
I think he's representative of the human spirit in general. I didn't have a specific person, but I did want to point to the people that created who destroyed children like this. So definitely, it's very clear who I point to in the book. If you read it, who I say is complicit in the creation of destruction of lives. But Hashim himself, to me, represented just humanity and how fragile and innocent it can be, and how it can be turned against itself.
Do